Let's come back to the way in which the symmetry of pairedness obviates the disassociation of polarity and duality in favor of a stable triple quality of form and process, and the way in which a frame, a square of attention, a frame of reference can be expanded indefinitely, so that one eventually emerges conscious of a field. This field is the origin source of the universe. And that fieldness permeates like a horizon of infinity and a verticality of infinity throughout the entire analytical and aesthetical appreciation of where we are, of who we are, of what we are doing. We live in a powerful series, a set of enormous waves having its origins in an earthquake, a distant earthquake, by which civilization began to take its form, and a series of threshold waves about 6,000 years ago has accumulated its time energy and expanded its space of domain so that we live at the beginnings of the 21st century in an accumulation of tsunami-set waves. The crest of that series of waves came in 1991. There are preceding waves increasing, and there are following waves decreasing. And in this way, when one is learned to have the calculus of time forms of civilization, you can see that the increase comes because there is a reference wave that began to accentuate the acceleration towards what we would call a horizon of fertile experience that is able to take the seeds of what is planted, to nourish, to grow, to develop, and to bring finally to a carrier wave harvest. That reference wave that precedes the tsunami of the carrier wave in that set, that reference wave has a preparation, and that preparation is in a crest of the time wave energy, the power of manifesting through the time forms of civilization. We call that crest a renaissance. In a very similar calibration and analytic and aesthetic, a crest will have its symmetry with a trough. They are like the apex of the sun, the apex of the moon going into its dark quality phase, so that the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter dark of the moon give us a hypotenuse of a year, a very important great year quality, which then cuts larger and larger hypotenuses, diameters, horizons, verticals, so that one comes to understand that the crest of a carrier wave's energy will be a resonance, and the trough of that same carrier wave will be 500 years after the carrier wave. And unfortunately, we do not have a really usable, viable name for that. Everyone understands Renaissance. The recent way to name that, that trough was through Aldous Huxley. He called it the via negativa, which unfortunately translates as the negative way. It's not the negative way. It's the way of no phenomena visible. It's still the way. It's still the great way. It's still the energy of a sine wave of civilization as the time form of the complexity that we are, have been, will live in together. There are different rhythms in the vast array of interstellar civilizations, but they all share this quality of having their time frame, their time form sets, which will have their renaissances, which will have their via negativas. It's interesting because in order to really understand what a via negativa trough would be, one can understand a renaissance at 500 BC, heading towards a 0 BC, gaining energy and momentum, so that at 0 BC, instantly, spontaneously becoming 1 AD. That calibration of 500 BC has its symmetry in a via negativa of 500 AD. And just as Pythagoras can be given an earmark as that Renaissance in the very large Greek international, he studied in Egypt for 22 years. He studied in Persia for 11 years. He was masterful in Ionian Greece and became even more masterful when he moved to southern Italy, to the heel, the boot of Italy, and so on. The Renaissance of Pythagoras became the via negativa of Dionysius the Areopagite about 500 AD. The church styles him as false Dionysus, pseudo-Dionysus. He certainly wasn't Dionysius the Areopagite, who appears in the New Testament in the letters, the epistles of Paul, that in Athens, one of the hearers of Paul in a deep insight was Dionysius the Areopagite being a district of Athens where the Acropolis looms as the center of everything that the city is, and down below it, the Areopagus, the quality of the civic life and emphasis of Athens. Prominent there on the Acropolis is the Parthenon, the feminine prajna paramita, the perfection of wisdom of Athena. And down below, the building that complements the Parthenon's femininity is the masculine stoa, a long arcade of power structures that all fit into this like a shopping center of Athenian empire power. And is there in that stoa that the Stoic philosophies are positioned. And in order to codify and make sure that everyone respects the Stoics, the teachers in the Stoa, before the Stoa, one takes a look and says, in making manufactured histories of Greek philosophy, that the number one Stoic was Posidonius. Not so at all. Posidonius gained his fame in teaching in Rhodes, not Athens. And he was a world traveler before that. He's the first Greek philosopher to go to Ireland, to go to the British Isles, to go to, before it was France, it was Gaul. He's the first to write a book on the Druids, the first Greek to understand Stonehenge. He's not somebody who's a professional teacher under the aegis of the Athenian Empire empowerment that they're bona fide teachers. We give them certificates. A Dionysius Areopagus, Dionysius the Areopagite, is like the symmetry with Pythagoras at the Renaissance crest. He is the epitome of that, quote, via negativa troth in its genius that is moderated, is modulated, is giving a proportion. For every proportion, there's a numerator and a denominator, mediated by a resolving third, which is the line written so that the numerator is above the line and the denominator is below the line, and yet the whole proportion depends on understanding that this is a ratio of unity when it is real, analytical, aesthetic, computable, expressible, writable, learnable. That middle horizon of the way in which a proportion is written can also be a colon. 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and thus you get the signature pacing of music, and so forth. There's a whole interesting thing. Dionysius the Areopagite, when one looks at the collection of his works, one finds right at the beginning, like a seed, is a short treatise called The Divine Names. And one finds another treatise called the Ecclesiastic set of the way in which one can understand actuality, the coming together of communities, not just the ecclesia as the church, which is a subset of community. And then there is a resolving third from the ecclesiastical hierarchies, the mystical hierarchies. And in the mystical hierarchies, there are divine, named, penetrating through the ecclesiastical hierarchies as the very field context in which they occur is this third field, the resolving field of the mystical hierarchies. One can tune because we are learnably tunable to the entire range, including into eternity. Because our source beginning then is not at 1, but at 0. And our recalibration to be at home in the 0 gives us a freedom in the infinite. And it happens to hold in logic as well. The quality of mystical hierarchies for Dionysius the Areopagite is that there is a triad of triads. Like the 9 muses that is brought together by the set, parenthetical, holder, creator of Apollo. The art of Apollo is that he's not so much a 10th, but that he is able to bring the 1s and the 0s together into a parenthetical expression of the infinite set resonances of the wise feminine, the wise muses. Not only the 9 muses, but their via negativa, which is the set of the 9 sibyls. So that one finds that there are not only mysteries upon mysteries, but there are transcendent structures, trans-structures. There are 3 spirit qualities times 3 for each of the way in which the mystical hierarchies then have this quality of triple triads in a set of 9 opening to a 10th, like a 10th heaven in the phrase, which gives access to not just an eternity of infinity, but to a fertility of beginning from the 0. So that the birth of Mother Nature to life is because she is fertile from eternal marriage. It is this quality in Pseudo-Dionysus that gives us an insight, because one sees that this is true of that Renaissance and of this via negativa. That there is a relationship then, because we have had a Renaissance about 1500 AD. The via negativa will be a whole 1,000 years away. But there was a previous carrier wave that had a previous Renaissance 2,000 years before Pythagoras. That 500 BC becomes 2500 BC. And when is the Renaissance then? One finds the great pyramids of Gaza in Egypt. One finds the maturity of Stonehenge in southern Britain. One finds many other aspects that all of a sudden have this Renaissance quality, and one has a via negativa about 1500 BC. And one of the most conspicuous, though almost not understood and appreciated. Persons carrying that 1500 BC, quote, via negativa, is Hatshepsut, who was the only female pharaoh in Egyptian history. She was found in the late 20th, early 21st century. And this is an infrared penetrating photograph of the skeletal remains of Hatshepsut. She was, by empire, tradition, and custom, by inculcation, by social demand and imposition, required on formal pharaonic festal occasions to wear a false beard, stylized just like the manicured, braided beard of the ancient pharaonic masculine power. It was a woman sitting in that throne, commandeering and making sure that one understood from a very wise spread. And it is she, among many other things that she was able to do. She had a daughter who was raised by the father, who was made to be the interfacer with a lot of the masculine power structures at the time, but he was in her court as the tutor of the daughter. And there's a famous sculpture from that era in bronze of a male Madonna who is encased in a cube that has hieroglyphic inscriptions on it. And emerging out of this cube is the torso portrait of the father and the little torso portrait of the daughter being seated facing outward on his lap within that cube. She also built one of the most futuristic looking tombs, Deir el-Bahari, across the Nile River from Karnak and Luxor and its masculine power structures. Hers is that clean, beautiful, horizontal, a ranch-style mega palace of several layers, and it looks like it could have been built literally as a late 20th century stoa of teaching in a very large, beautiful way. But she is most powerful because she is the one that established the sea route trade with India, so that Egypt and India had a concourse rhythmically every year under her reign and her visionary guidance, and that the shared port median of this was the confluence of the Red Sea emptying into the Arabian Ocean. One could sail at first by land from the mouth of the Indus, the power of India, 1500 BC, along the coast of what is today Pakistan, Iran, southern Arabia, Oman, Yemen, and to that passage where on one side is Yemen, and the other side is Ethiopia. And there, at that juncture, in that Red Sea, Arabian Gulf threshold, 500 years later, from Hatshepsut, that was the kingdom of Sheba. And the queen of Sheba was the direct inheritor of the powers of insight ruling that Hatshepsut had. And she left a millennium later from her in the Ethiopian royal tradition. An inheritor who was Queen Candace. And it is Queen Candace who was the Queen of Sheba at the time of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, of the apostles. And it was her trade caravan leader who not only ran caravans of animals, but ran also the caravans of shipping all the way down the Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea, to the ports centering around the ports of Axum, which was the real center at that time of the Queen of Sheba's power, became a center of Candace's power 1,000 years later. As Hatshepsut had a daughter, Sheba had a son. The father was Solomon. The son's name was Menelik. So that Menelik was an heir to the ancient Ethiopian power that was midway between Egypt and India in Ethiopian Africa. And the father was Solomon, who was the inheritor of a whole millennium of patriarchy. And when he was of age, when he was 21, his mother sent him to go meet his father, Solomon, who in the meantime had dissipated his energies. Too many concubines, too many wives, too much of too much. And so his son did a Solomonic that was worthy of being a spirit grandson of David, the father, King David, the father of Solomon. He went into Solomon's temple, he went into the Holy of Holies, and he stole the Ark of the Covenant and took it with him back to Ethiopia and deposited in his mother's palace in the mountains at Axum, and the Ark of the Covenant is still there. And 1,000 years later, it was still there when Queen Candace had asked for a disciple, for an apostle to be sent to her kingdom to teach. Because the caravan leader who had been given a baptismal beginning in all of this was Philip, the apostle Philip, who was very close because he was part of a triad of stability in being the ones who were the writers of what Jesus had said and did. There was Philip, there was Thomas, and there was Matthew. Thomas made the sayings of the living Jesus, the seeds. Matthew made the 5-part sermon way to grasp the meaning of what he said and did. And Philip about the mysteries of the bridal chamber, the bride and the groom, the way in which a shared presence, mystical, not hierarchy, but dimensional expansion at home in the zeros and the infinities equally free. This quality showed up in Matthew going along with Thomas, who was on his way to India. That Matthew went to Ethiopia. And as Thomas died in India after several decades there, Matthew died in Ethiopia after several decades there. Unless one understands time forms, none of this is available for wisdom, because Hatshepsut, to the development of the via negativa of Dionysius the Areopagite also carries with it many mysteries yet to be understood. One of them is that one of the great geniuses at the time was Boethius, famous for the learned survival of his book, The Consolation of Philosophy, but blanked out largely and saved just by miraculous saving intervention, his great understanding of music, of musical composition. And also Proclus, who was a confrere of Boethius, of Dionysius the Areopagite, who was the last of the great Pythagoreans, the last of the great Platonic, Neoplatonic developers, because just as there was a Posidonius following Plato, following him was Philo of Alexandria, and a series that led Alexandria to become a fertile ground for the real understanding through a prism, which was a set of collected writings called the Hermetica, which eventually had a native genius growing up and understanding in the Alexandria of the early 3rd century from his teacher Ammonius Saccas. His name was Plotinus. And he knew and understood that one has to be able to take this Egyptian wisdom with its Greek language, given a great radiant starburst by a Hellenistic Jewish star of understanding, one had to go to India to make a consummation, a completion. Not so much a completion even, but a perfection. He couldn't get to India, though he was in the entourage of the Roman emperor who was seeking to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. He was defeated. Plotinus couldn't get to India, couldn't get to the burgeoning great Mahayana at the time, that by the 3rd century, by about 250 AD, was spectacular. The India of Ashoka. And so he retreated back, not to Alexandria, but to Rome, and taught in Rome for the rest of his life in his house, a very large villa in Rome. So large and so entrusted that the Roman Emperor Aurelius and his wife were part of his students. And the sons especially of the cognoscenti, wealthy, were sent to live in Plotinus's house so that they were raised right. A whole city was planned for Plotinus to have his teaching expanded to an urban area, to a philosophic city. But he contracted and died from diphtheria around 70 AD. In order to understand time forms, one has to be able to understand that reference wave power is the initial ascent from the trough. That a reference wave is bringing the collection back into its ascent. And it's like the blast off of a rocket that has all of its power spent in getting off the pad, getting into the ascent where there is less resistance, and that a reference wave comes about 150 years after a trough. So that the reaching of the horizontal equanimity, which would be the millennium of a millennial reference wave, is that equilibrium there that harkens back to the ascent from the via negativa, so that millennia always carry a jittery subcurrent that is mostly expressed in terms of worldly power then in millennia, but when a carrier wave comes in 1,000 years later and is impeded, the resistance to the carrier wave goes back to the millennium, sidestepping its reference wave to the previous. Enough for today.